Hello, Furidashi listeners. In this, our 100th episode, all right, we finally tackled 2013's The Last of Us. While we acknowledge that the story is, well, arguably just kind of okay, we also dissect the game's level and encounter design to see how The Last of Us creates compelling experiences for the player. We also look at the companion system and how the game elicits empathy through the complex interactions between Joel and Ellie and the perspectives the game forces us to adopt. If you like what we do, you can sign up at patreon.com/Furidashi, where you'll receive bonus content like an extra full episode every month. There's no need to feel obligated, though, and whatever you choose, we're glad you're here to share our oddball game dev journey together. And so with that, on with the show.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's super special, secret, fantastic, I guess not so secret,
It's not really
non-Patreon,
It's very public.
100th episode.
100 episodes! Yes! Well,
This
I mean,
is why
technically we've done more episodes than that, but it's the 100th numbered episode.
It is the 100th numbered episode, and I think that's what's the most important here, okay? Is it's like a 100-year anniversary, but it's like
Wow.
This is game development, and even making a podcast is part of game development.
Yeah.
So first of all, we wanted to say thank you so much for listening and subscribing to our Patreon, to all of our Patreon listeners out there. We could not have done this without you. And having 100 podcast, like numbered episodes is incredible, really.
It's kind of crazy, yeah.
I don't actually think that when we started this, I ever have thought about us creating 100 episodes. Like, it never really occurred to my mind
No.
that we would be here.
No.
And now here we are, and we're going to keep doing this. And then we're going to get to 200 episodes. And then what am I going to do? Am I going to cry? Because I'm already tearing up.
So yeah, I mean, our Patreon subscribers are important to us. And so if you want to sign up for our Patreon, go to patreon.com/Furidashi. And if you do so, you're not just like shoveling money at us. You get a bonus episode every month and even occasional bonus like content that we put up there. So it's $5 a month. It's an incredible value because in the Patreon episodes are really where we get into sort of like the theoretical discussions, a lot more sort of like practical hands-on, game dev stuff. So if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in and you want more of that, that's where you have to go. We still talk about those things in our free episodes, but the Patreon episodes are really where to go to sort of get the juicy meat. The meat, whereas this is like the frosting.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe you just said like the meat of the game development, because I swear every time I get into like a discussion, it's like, this is how the sausage gets made. Like, welcome to AAA development, everyone. If you want to go from indie to AAA, you can
what is
go
the
to
vegan
our
version of that metaphor?
our
then?
Beyond sausage,
Our
because
Beyond-
we're already using Unreal Engine, so might
Oh,
as
that's
well.
true. Yeah, Unreal.
Achieving the impossible, meat. Okay, everyone.
Speaking of meat,
No. Anyway, speaking of meat and fleshy substances, today for our 100th episode, well, it's very topical, and we're trying to be a little bit more like on trend, I guess you
Yeah.
could say.
by talking about a game from 2013, we're being very topical.
Yes, we're going to be very on trend. No, it's speaking of fleshy meat, right? We're here to talk about zombies. And particularly, it's because when we look at a recent argument that I guess has been going around in my circles, at least, is what's better, the show or the game? And that being The Last of Us.
Yep. Part one. As far as the games go, we're only going to talk about part one.
Yeah, as far as games go. But like back in the day, like The Last of Us didn't have a part 1 and a part 2. It was just the game.
Yeah.
And I would say that I think for me, I haven't actually seen the show, and that's because my HBO Max subscription just expired, and I have decided not to get it back yet because I'm kind of waiting for Our Flag Means Death, like season 2 or season 3 or whatever,
Oh,
to
yeah,
also
yeah.
come out, and then I'll just watch both of them at the same time. I'll be like really sad and then really happy. Like that's
It,
my 2 trends.
so I've watched a couple episodes of the HBO series with a friend of mine who has an account, and it's fine. It's fine.
Well, and
Like
so
I don't know.
here's the thing: is this is 100th episode, and we're not really here to kind of debate what's better, the show or the game. But what we
Yeah.
did want to kind of like start with that is that that's kind of what we're talking about in AAA. Is that if you believe the show is better than the game, right? And I shouldn't say AAA because not all of my friends are in AAA now. They're in AA, which is just really where AAA designers that went to start a new studio. Okay, long story short is that The Last of Us, when it came out as a game, was absolutely kind of like mind blowing to the public,
Yeah,
right?
it was an epochal moment, and in many
It
ways, it still is very much a touchstone. Yeah,
It is very much a touchstone. And I think, regardless of whichever studio, whichever title you're working on, using The Last of Us as a shorthand for like a very cinematically driven narrative experience where the entire game almost services this larger story arc is
yeah,
just that's the shorthand for when you go, hey, we're not like The Last of Us, right? It's also a shorthand for we're not doing really great cinematic quality, but The Last of Us 2013 didn't really have the best cinematic quality either. Like, I would almost
no,
argue Battlefield 1 cinematics are now, right, in modern day times, more cinematic than the original
there
Last of Us.
there is interesting camera work in The Last of Us, but it's not necessarily in sort of the like cutscene moments. It's actually much more interesting in like gameplay moments than
No, it
otherwise. Yeah,
really is in the gameplay moments. So
yeah,
for that note, right, we actually will be sidestepping the show a little bit to kind of go into the history, the encounter design, the story itself, the mechanics, character, and all of the other stuff that you know us for as we kind of transition into what made the game so great
yeah,
and what really kind of shifted, right, the industry from talking about ourselves as like story driven games or cinematic games or linear to even using, right, a game title to show we're not doing the, right, Last of Us moment, or we're not doing XYZ, right?
yeah,
And why are we still referencing this, right, incredible game?
yeah.
So keep
So I
listening and exciting for this journey to start. Nicholas, take us
all right.
away.
So one of the things that I had a not a problem, but sort of like was but nibbling away at my brain as I was trying to think about like how to talk about this is that when I was playing The Last of Us recently, so this would have been back in like January and early February. I was playing through it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's it's a pretty good game. Not earth shattering, nothing especially like really struck me as like this revolutionizes the way I think about video games. And I was like, okay, well, so then and then I did my standard thing, which is I go, read reviews and whatnot. And this game is like universal, almost, not exclusively, almost universally beloved. And I was like, really? Nobody had any objection to do anything in this game ever, and that was very odd to me. Like I did eventually find a couple of pieces written by. There's actually a really interesting Polygon review from around the time the game came out that is also kind of like, yeah, it's fine, and in many ways sort of summarized my feelings, like, yeah, it's fine. And so, but the thing is, like in the discourse around this game, you hear people harping. It's like, oh, the story is so amazing, the story is so great, the story, and I was like, the story's fine, the story's fine. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that, like, though there are some like novel twists on the zombie slash like post-apocalyptic narrative, that there was so much media in the like aughts and the teens, the 2000s and 2010s, that either like was post-apocalyptic or zombie focused, or combined the two into zombie apocalypse and so forth. Like there's just so much of it. And The Last of Us really sort of fits firmly within that context. You could sort of add it to a list of all of those things. And there are a couple of things that I personally think that it's very explicitly drawing from, which is Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road, and then also the film that came out in, I think it was 2009, that was adapted from it. Like there's a very clear, like, and Lauren, you had mentioned when we were talking earlier that it seems to draw very explicitly from I Am Legend, which the film came out in 2007, shortly before production began on The Last of Us. So there's just so much stuff that they had to draw from that they weren't really reinventing the wheel in terms of like, world building. Actually, well, world building we'll come back to, but in terms of like, story-based world building, so to speak, that it just didn't feel like it was a terribly novel thing.
Right. And I think that actually really led to their kind of success in this genre as well. I think before kind of this, I don't know what, it's not so much before. I think books, right, had come out way before, right? Like this sort of 2006, 2008, right? We've
Yeah.
been talking about post-apocalyptic kind of zombieism forever, right? It was
Oh, and
always
The Walking
something
Dead
of,
is another obvious like
and
thing that it's drawing from.
right. And The Walking Dead is huge, super obvious. And that's kind of what I was going to say is that it wasn't really until we got to this sort of humanity's struggle, right, versus the unknown, versus the fears of extinction, versus like the fear of like existence, like there wasn't this extra threat, that I think in like the popular media, there was kind of this resurgence of like, well, for all we know, it actually could also be the housing crisis, right, of 2008, and then also Facebook started in 2010,
Or the war
and
on
I feel like
terror. They're very like
the war
war on
on
terror.
terror,
Yeah.
there after 2001, right? Like
Yeah.
there was a lot going on in the early 2000s, particularly in America, right? And that's kind of our centered here if we look at the cultural milieu, particularly these titles coming out of America, right? So
Yeah.
just be aware,
Well,
our
and the
global
game is set in the
audiences,
United States too.
and the
So
game is
yeah.
set in the United States, right? But that's what I'm saying is just be aware, global audiences, that we're not sure what's going on in your countries. Though I'm sure like the war on terror and American politics are a fun topic at the dinner table everywhere we go.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that when we look at these titles and we look at, a kind of a cultural moment for video games, right? It was kind of a cultural phenomenon for these post-apocalyptic media, as well as particularly zombie media,
Yeah.
right? That was coming out during this time. And there was this type of kind of societal learning and kind of yearning for like, in a world, like let's say we have really destroyed the entire world because that's how it seems like it's going, right? And I
Yeah.
think since then apocalyptic literature has continued. It wasn't about dystopian, right? Dystopian is about if the world continues, we get into this utopic dystopic society, right?
Yeah.
Like a society that seems good on the surface but is actually bad. It was, no, we fucked shit up so much, we have caused the apocalypse, right?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that
Pretty much.
is the biggest, right, difference for me literarily, is that we had dystopic literature, right? And we've had dystopic films, movies. I mean, Blade Runner is a great example, just like right off the bat, of what I would
Yeah.
consider a little dystopic in the world building. And this is where kind of I'm going with this. Versus post-apocalyptic, right? Like there wasn't an apocalypse in Blade Runner, right? Like the world just increased, or Neuromancer for a book reference, right?
Yeah.
There wasn't, we just kept going, right? And a lot of science fiction was going to dystopia. But now we actually see a trend, not just like in, say, science fiction, right? But also in just speculative fiction in general, that it's now, no, the apocalypse has happened. Like
Yeah.
it's going to happen. We are actually going to kill our planet, our Earth, ourselves, the environment. Like there's going to be war is going to kill this, etc. And one of the easiest or one of these ways, right, was zombieism. And so I
Yeah.
think this is really important because what really worked in their favor was during this time, right, whether they were also having these thoughts about the war on terror, right, what was going on, let's create an apocalypse scenario. This is really what was kind of fueling this type of moment, this type of genre.
Well, I think it's also important just briefly to touch on sort of like the changing conceptualization of zombies in popular media, because if you go back to sort of like the Romero films, Night of the Living Dead being the most obvious one, there the zombie, you can interpret it a bunch of different ways, but zombies are in many ways kind of a metaphor for the way in which a large part of the United States was sort of sleepwalking through various crises, be it the war in Vietnam, the racial reckoning that was happening, in the late 60s, and especially given the way, I'm not going to spoil it, given the way the Night of the Living Dead ends, like there's a very clear like racial cast to a lot of what's going on there, to zombies becoming, especially after like, I would definitely point to say like Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later as sort of like figuring the zombie as this like dehumanization, this like broad dehumanization, or sort of this effect of like, mankind going too far. Lauren, as you were saying, like, we as humanity caused the apocalypse to happen, rather than the zombie apocalypse being this sort of like manifestation of a kind of like difficult undercurrent in American society. Like those are two very different things.
I think that's really important here is that in a lot of apocalyptic stories that you get from earlier, like, wow, earlier human history, like that was the worst thing to say, but sorry, but when you look at apocalyptic stories, like there's the apocalypse, right, already comes from this kind of biblical, right, underpinning. And I'm
Yeah.
pointing that out because when a lot of apocalypse stories are, a meteor hit, right? You get a lot of this in the early 1900s in science fiction, like a meteor hits. Humanity
War of
has
the
to
Worlds
escape
being
the
yeah,
planet.
yeah,
The
yeah,
world, something is happening that is
yeah,
natural, right? It's a
yeah,
natural phenomenon that humans can't control because we don't control nature, we don't control God, we don't control the cosmos,
yeah,
right? Well, suddenly when we look after the modern period, we recognize that humanity is like much more like profitable after World War II, right? We all want to avoid World War III. We realize that World War II fundamentally, like we controlled that, right?
yeah,
Humans were responsible for that. And I think that's kind of like in the postmodernist period, you now get a humans are responsible, right?
yeah,
This is during the modern period is trying to come to terms, right, with the responsibility of humanity's utter destruction. And postmodernism is a yes, we do cause destruction. What if we just destroyed the whole planet because it's our fault now? And I think
yeah,
that's this kind of crises of zombies come out of a like they are a humanoid, right? They are a human. You have to be a human to be a zombie, right? And I
yeah.
think that's the struggle of humanity right there that is now my nugget, right, for The Last of Us.
I
So,
want to add one last little thorn before we move on to talking about Uncharted and its relationship to this. And that's that, and this especially comes out of, so I'm, for those of you who don't know, I used to teach Japanese studies courses. And in the study of apocalyptic fiction, there is a lot of theorizing about the way in which apocalypse functions as a kind of reset. And there's this idea that sort of like humanity has gotten itself into this like political slash cultural slash technological bind that it can't get out of, and then the apocalypse essentially like resets the human condition back to a point where before it began to diverge down this dark path that dominated our destiny. And that I think is actually another thing that's kind of going on here in the Last of Us. There is this idea that you can sort of like reset the human condition in this extremely brutal way, and that plays out in a lot of the zombie media as well. Like human social relations are transformed, technological conditions are transformed, and you can sort of like start over from a different baseline. I just wanted to add that as like another point about all of
no, no,
this.
no, no, no. I was silent because I was sometimes I have the intense staring face. And when Nicholas goes, oh, I just wanted to belabor that point. I'm like, no, I am intensely staring at such academic credential. I'm like, oh, why don't I think of it like that?
Well, I've
I mean,
taught this in
I
several classes. That's why I know
I
about it.
mean, no, but exactly. I took those classes. Well, I took some of those classes. Damn
Yeah.
it. Well, now we all know that
Lauren was not paying attention in my
I was
class.
not
That's
paying
very
attention in your
no.
classes.
Lauren was generally paying attention. She was fine.
No, anyway, so I think this is a really great point, though, in that we wanted to also kind of talk about the studio, right? So this is
Yeah.
like the cultural background, but the studio, right, members are part of the cultural background coming into this.
Well,
We
yeah,
wanted to
Naughty
kind
Dog
of,
is a culture in and of itself. Yeah.
yeah. So like the Naughty Dog culture, right? When they were making The Last of Us, we also wanted to kind of hint at, or not hint at, sorry, we wanted to kind of hit on the topic of like the development of Uncharted, right,
Yeah.
versus the development of The Last of Us.
Yeah, and because the team that Druckmann and Straley, who were the two sort of like co-directors for The Last of Us, both came. So there was a sort of like a broad creative team that worked on Uncharted 2. And after, Uncharted 2 was a huge success, it won Game of the Year, if I remember correctly. At that point, then Naughty Dog decided to split that like Uber team into two separate teams. One that went on to develop the subsequent Uncharted games, and then another one headed by Druckmann and Straley that went on to develop The Last of Us and ultimately its sequel as well. And this is important because a lot of that Uncharted DNA is still in The Last of Us, especially if you look at, say, like the combat systems. The combat system in see, I'm both going to state this and problematize it at the same time. The combat system in The Last of Us has a lot of superficial similarities to what you see in Uncharted, because in many ways they often are using the same baseline like systems.
And when you talk about the combat system, you're specifically talking about the ranged combat system?
Yeah, the ranged combat
Yeah,
specifically.
ranged combat system. I just wanted
Like,
to kind of reiterate that because the melee system was incredibly unique specifically for The Last of Us
yeah, and that's
versus the
the
ranged system.
complication, which is that sort of like, if you think about, a particular scenario in Uncharted 2 where like, there's a bunch of usually Russians who are like standing off at a distance firing at you, and you are crouched behind a crate at a distance from them, and you're both shooting at each other or lobbing grenades. Like that is a very, even though it uses the same baseline system, that is a very different kind of combat from being the guy with a gun, Joel, as literally a clicker is rushing towards you and you have to try and down them before they get on top of you, because if they get on top of you, you're dead. Like that is actually a very different subjective experience of combat, even if it uses a lot of the same like underlying stuff. And so that's what I mean by sort of like problematizing it a little bit, because in Uncharted, you're generally, as Drake, fighting enemies who have rough similarities to you. Whereas in The Last of Us, as Joel and then later as Ellie, you are fighting enemies that are sometimes like you, because sometimes they are other people, but oftentimes are very dissimilar from you in terms of mechanically how you have to sort of engage with them. And that is a really important distinction.
Right. And as we kind of like look at that distinction, for me, I think what's funny is that when I played the game, I know that I killed more humans than zombies as Joel. Like I
Yeah.
absolutely was ill equipped to fight the different AI that represented the zombie force.
You
I
can
really
cheese it.
tried.
You can cheese it. I cheesed it. I have to admit that I
I
cheesed it.
I don't even know how to cheese it. Like, I'm not going to lie. Is that I tried very hard to have the same amount of resources, and I would go through these encounters. I would kill pretty much the majority of zombies, and what would happen is I would end up dying at like the very last moment, and I would have to replay the entire encounter again.
So the way to
And I think,
so the way to
and I was
cheese it
just
was like, so because you always have like your companions like within some proximity of you. So what you want to do is you want to move Joel around so that way that like essentially the companion is leading, and then you use the companion to like tank whoever is coming at you, like because they'll hit the companion first, and even though you do have to like, they will eventually overcome your companion and you'll have to restart the level. But it does give you enough time to like aim and shoot them, or to like get around them and shiv them
I
or
wouldn't say
punch
that's
them.
cheesing. I think that we'll actually get into like how the companion mechanics of this work. So maybe
Yeah,
let's bring that up
yeah.
at a
I'll say
future
I'll
date.
save
I
that for
think
the mechanics.
yeah,
But
let's like, not a future date, but like a future timestamp, right? I think for now, what I'm really excited by is when I look at the way that I looked at the level design. I think
yeah,
my point was that much like Uncharted, where you are just like kind of cover shooting, right? You
yeah,
actually aren't able to cover shoot too effectively in this game, even
no,
when you have human enemies, because the human enemies, there's so many of them, but they kind of run around you in a similar fashion to zombies. So
yeah,
what I really believe for me is that if we look at the development kind of structure of this like organization, when I looked at that, I can go, okay, they're obviously talking to each other, but
yeah,
quite frankly, right, they're two different games, two different needs. And I think that it's going to be really interesting as we move into the encounter design portion, as Nicholas is calling it, to kind of see the structures of how Nicholas and I played in different ways and
yeah.
still kind of achieved in some right levels and some like encounters kind of the same feeling from those experiences.
Yeah, the combat is strangely like, it is capacious. Like it allows for even though it is very limiting, and if you feel how limiting combat can be in the game, and I think that's intentional because like it creates this sort of like experience of being beset at all times. It's like, oh god, how the fuck do I get through this? And so the reason why I wanted to call this encounter design is that originally when I was trying to think about like, okay, so if it's not the story that's really sort of like grabbing me about this game, what is it that's grabbing me about this game? Because there is something. And initially I settled on like, well, it must be the level design, like because the way in which like the levels sort of structure how you have to interact with enemies, how you have to traverse, like even though it's kind of silly, like the fact that you periodically like look off into the distance at, like your ultimate destination, like it's interesting because it helps orient what feels like just sort of like a sequence of boxes that you're moving through. Like you always have this sense of like where it fits within a series and what its ultimate trajectory is. It's like, but that's not necessarily strictly level design. And so then I was listening to an interview that Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit did with a former level designer from Naughty Dog, and there was an offhand comment that the designer made that I thought was really interesting because it pointed to how he and his colleagues conceptualize levels not necessarily as sort of like boxes in which things happen or a series of boxes in which things happen, but rather as sort of like a diorama for what the level actually is, which is sort of a series of, I'm going to use an academic term here, unfortunately, like subjective conditions. Meaning that, like, at this point in this zone or area, environment, whatever, we want the player to feel like X. Then at this point in the zone, we want the player to feel like Y. And then at this point in the zone, we want the player to feel like Z. And Z, then if you reflect back on X, really sort of recolors how that whole thing plays out. So that is the focus. And the reason why I called it encounter design is because that's the thing that seemed closest to what this particular level designer was talking about. And
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say for me, I was struggling with this term for Nicholas before this episode was aired or on the air. Um, because when we look at encounter design, it's very easy to say that an encounter, right, is basically an activity or a usually a combat encounter, right?
Yeah,
But it
yeah,
could be any sort of gameplay challenge that any sort of level designer, scripter, content designer, narrative designer, like whomever, right?
yeah,
Puts in front of the player. And the design of that encounter is it going to have a puzzle? Is it require a companion? Is it a traversal, right, encounter? Do you need to kind of go through this area?
yeah,
Is it a logic, right, encounter? Is it actually a riddle? Do you have to talk to someone? Is it a combat encounter? Right?
yeah,
And so when I look at encounter design, a lot of the times we look at it as encounters not as a kind of means to an end, right? Not serving a greater purpose. We look at
yeah,
encounters as like a smaller subsection, right, of a larger, right, milieu of gameplay challenges
yeah,
and mechanics.
yeah,
And I struggled with this because I like the more wording of a subjective, right, condition, right,
yeah,
or subjective experience of this area, because a lot of level designers will tell you that that is how they level design. Like they level design with this is what I want the players to feel in this moment.
yeah,
And I think that a lot of those level designers tend to come from single player experiences,
yeah,
right? Not necessarily multiplayer experiences. And I only
yeah,
mention that because when you look at a multiplayer level or even an open world level, you're not really looking at as a this is what I want the player to feel in that area. You're looking at as a this is kind of the tutorial area or the starting zone of an MMO where
yeah,
players are going to be learning the mechanics, and so it just kind of becomes a sandbox. And I think that's why I don't like the sandbox term, because for
yeah,
me it's
yeah,
like everything might be toys and you might be playing with it, but you're playing a game, right? It's a simulation. At a certain point of your sandbox, like maybe it's flooded and now suddenly it's a swamp, right? So I think that
yeah. Well,
there's
and
something to be said for like how subjective do you make that area, right, versus
yeah.
how like objective is that area to serve the purpose of the game. And so I think that the encounter design is a really fascinating way to kind of call it for now, but
Well,
there is
because it's not
it's
just
more than
just
that.
encounter design. It's also the encounter design, but as structured as, and this is why I called it sort of like a series of subjective conditions, because in many ways it's a series of encounters and the way in which that series works. Because if you look at the way in which sort of the levels kind of frame and encompass uh encounters, for lack of a better term, or sort of things that you have to do in the game, there is a kind of plot structure to them, and that's where story, if we're going to talk about it in broader terms. And this is why I said earlier that I sort of held world building off to one side. World building, the traditional sense, not so much, but here we have a very different kind of world building as like, well, you're literally creating a world because you're making, the container in which these things happen. But okay, let's talk about an example. An example is probably a better way to do this. So
No, yeah.
early on in the game, a common thing that you have to do is you have to move a dumpster, or you have to move something or a ladder into position, so that way you can like progress further on to where you need to go. Because like the first sort of stage of the game, like, getting Ellie to the Capitol building, this is fundamental. Even though it involves combat encounters and whatnot, it's primarily traversal in nature. Like you're trying to get from point A to point Z with, all of the letters in between as like waypoints. And so there's this common thing that happens where you have to like move a dumpster into position, so that way you can climb on top of something so that you can progress. This happens consistently. So this would be the X, or sorry, the X and Y in our sequence, where like it sort of establishes the X and then the Y. They establish a pattern of this thing that you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to relate to it. Because usually in those moments, they're quieter. They don't necessarily involve combat encounters. Like it's literally, you just have to go find the thing that you have to move it over, and then you go on. Then you do it again. You find the thing that you have to move over, and you go on. And then those moments are interspersed with, say, combat encounters, where like you might be moving through an underground space where there are some clickers, and you either have to evade them or you have to try and shiv them or whatever. So in that instance, like it's both setting up this idea of you have to move a thing in order to traverse, while also in a separate instance setting up this idea of like combat encounters. So there's a moment early on in the game where you sort of like come out into a fairly large open space, and then there is a closed building off to the left as you go forward. Tess, who is still with you at that time, she goes forward and she says, "Oh, okay, we got to try and find a way around this bus." And you're like, "Oh, from all those previous moments, I know what I'm supposed to do here. I need to go find the dumpster or whatever the thing is that I have to move, and then move it into position, and then we can go forward." And similarly, it has a similar set before, because initially that's a quiet moment. You move into this big open space and you don't see any enemies. Like there doesn't seem to be any like obvious combat encounters that are going to take place. None of the characters mention it in their dialogue. So it's like, okay, I got to go find the dumpster. And you do. You find the dumpster inside of a building surrounded by a bunch of infected. And what's interesting is how, like, then sort of once we hit our Z point in that series, this is what I mean by it then sort of recolors like that initial it's almost set up like a joke, but the feeling is not a funny one. The feeling one is kind of an oh shit one. And so you go into that because you walk into the building, it's like, oh, I'm gonna go grab the dumpster, and then you walk into the building, it's like, oh crap. So then you immediately have to you have to move out of that framework where you're like, I have to find the dumpster in movement. And then you have to somehow integrate that with the combat thinking. The two sort of like things that you've been set up with are now synthesized into this moment. And that is largely a function of level design. But it's not just level design, because it's also the way in which sort of like Tessa's dialogue has set you up to think that it's just another one of these quiet moments. It's also like, okay, I recognize this because I've seen the other move the dumpster, moments in the game. Like you have been set up to sort of at first believe that it's a particular kind of thing, and then it pulls the rug out from under you. And then you have to deal with all the infected. You still have to move the dumpster and, climb over, I think it's a bus that's in the way. I don't remember exactly. But that series of encounters and the way in which sort of like level, story, dialogue, like all, even combat, because there's combat involved as well, like all of those things are sort of like introduced separately along the series, and then they are synthesized at the not the end, because stuff happens after that. But to me, there's a logical sequence there that has a kind of plot structure to it that is very encounter design centric.
I think for me, the biggest thing that comes to mind when I look at this from the level design standpoint is that like some skeptical, people that are listening to this would be like, that's just really good level design. Like, because levels is a part of encounters and combat and structure and narrative and story and even VFX, VO, right? Dialogue. But when you kind of get to the VO dialogue portion and you get to kind of setting up that narrative and setting up the moments of tension, that is just really good level design. But it's also really good moment to moment design. And I think that that's sometimes devalued as a simply trading of punches between two characters, right? Combat design is not moment to moment design, right? Moment to moment design can be the moment between you go from right needing to find that dumpster to switching your thinking to combat to getting the dumpster and having combat.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the entire game experience, right, itself is building upon that sort of fidelity, because if you move the dumpster, it creates noise. You know that you need to kill the zombies, but you'll be overrun if you kill them too quickly, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's really something to be said for what you kind of were talking about there with the constrained perspective, and about how
Yeah.
they use the
Yeah.
constrained perspective to create those moments of dramatic tension as you move through the levels.
Yeah, and that constraint is not always exclusively in terms of like the series that I identified. Oftentimes it literally like so there's that moment where Joel is so you walk into so it's you're going to look for Bill, who's this guy that Joel knows who lives outside of Boston, and you walk into a warehouse, and all of a sudden a trap springs on Joel. Joel is suspended upside down, so that means also that your player perspective has now been inverted, and you have to do a thing that you are familiar with from before, which is sort of protect Ellie from all of the infected that are coming towards her. But you have to do it in this fundamentally different way, precisely because the camera has like literally inverted you. Or one of my favorite moments is when okay, we're going to be spoiling things about the game, guys. So
No,
we'll
it's
just
at this point, it's 2013. Like, it's gonna be fine.
so
Anyway, continue.
there is a moment where Ellie is fighting this guy named David. Actually, I don't need to explain anything other than that. She's fighting this guy named David, and then she gets pushed to the ground, and the camera, your player perspective, then goes down with her, and you see the knife that she is reaching for, and you yourself are trying to push her towards it. And the only thing that you see of David is his foot come down as he's stomping on your hand. Like that constraint as well colors the, as I was saying before, these subjective conditions that the game is trying to put you in. And there are a lot of like sort of interlocking parts that come from aspects of game dev that are often siloed and distinct. And so like it's actually kind of remarkable that these things are
Well, and
working
I think that
together.
actually kind of comes down to the production quality of this too, is that they had really multidisciplinary teams,
Yeah.
kind of all came together for a particular, right, set piece. And like I think that's maybe coming from my like film or like stage play background here when I look at like this is a set piece, but really in the game development set piece world, when I was in Bill's town and I activated the trap as Joel in the cutscene and flipped over and they inverted my camera to match, right? Joel's like he is upside down
Yeah.
versus what they kind of could have done, right? And this is a bit of another alternative is I see myself from an objective perspective,
Yeah.
right? With the camera being outside and I can kind of move Joel kind of like a normal third person camera,
Well, and that's what
okay?
they do in Uncharted. Like
And that's what they do in Uncharted is
When
that and
Drake
then I
finds himself,
just
yeah,
right.
yeah,
But here's the difference. Here's the big difference, right? Is that in Uncharted, I am playing an action kind of adventure game with no elements of horror.
yeah.
I am in control. I am Drake. I am Nathan Drake, okay?
You are Laura Croft. Yeah.
I am Laura Croft. Yep. I am in control. I am in power. I have a hand in the situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is a moment of not only surprise but terror.
Yeah.
And it's thrilling, right? Like I am
Yeah.
afraid, but there is thrill in the terror, right? There
Yeah.
is this knowingness that I have got to get my shit together. I am constrained in my perspective,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's what's really important to note is that even though this is a third person kind of game and I have this really wide open third person camera, like I can usually see everything, there are very important moments where when they want me to feel a certain way, right? I felt that. And what's funny is that I also felt the opposite. And the opposite was the cynical game developer going, oh, yeah,
But
this is a
Lauren.
game. And no, I really did. As soon as they did that in Billstown, I was like, all right, this is a game. Like, this is good. Damn
Yeah,
it.
there I agree. There were a lot of times I'm not going to say that it was gimmicky because it's not, but I definitely felt like I see what you did there. Good
So,
job.
yeah, exactly. I see what
Yeah.
you did there. Good job. And the reason why, like, we're spending a lot of time on this for me particularly is that this type of level design or encounter design, this type of subjective design is only possible when you look at the subjective experience, right, of your
Yes.
players.
Yep.
And what's really funny is that unfortunately, being in the narrative kind of like world, a lot of that subjective experience tend to kind of falls on the narrative design plate
Yep.
because narrative tends to right hold the reins, so to speak, quote unquote, of what a subjective experience is. But I think for anybody out there who isn't in narrative, doesn't have any classical like story training, isn't an academic, I want you to know that as a former level designer, level design really, right, and moment to moment, right, this type of encounter design can
Yeah.
really make or break and actually inform what the narrative would be, right? Because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
like the player is the interactor, right, of this incredible moment. And even if I saw this moment in a TV or film, or a show, I don't know if this moment is in the show or not, but what I would say is that if I saw this in a TV show, I would go, oh, this is fun. Like, he's upside down and he has to shoot. Ha ha. But when you play this moment in The Last of Us and you're upside down and you have to defend Ellie, and you're just like, Ellie, like, gosh damn it. Like, you can fucking do this. You can fucking do this. And then Joel himself is going, Ellie, you can fucking do this. Get the fuck out of it with Ellie. Right? Like,
Mhm.
oh my God. Okay. Have to protect her. Oh shit. Got to protect myself. Oh God, a clicker. Like,
Yeah.
that moment of tension is only possible when you have this level of cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary, like a weaving right into that moment. And I think before we that's what I wanted to say before we move into the more kind of mechanical and systemic things that I was really compelled about this game.
Yeah. And the thing is, well, it transitions well, because that feeling of being sort of beset, I guess, is the best way is the way I would describe it throughout the entire game. Like, you never feel like you can just rest. And even in moments where the game seems like it can tell you to rest, it makes you a little bit paranoid, because you do wonder, like, okay, so when is it going to pull the rug out from under me? Like, what is the next like effed up thing that's going to happen that is going to make me feel bad about the fact that I thought I could finally just like take a breather? And a lot of that works in the way, so another like primary constraint of the game is sort of like the relationship that you have as like whichever player character you are at a given time, usually Joel, sometimes Ellie though, and your companions. And so, not just like your constant companion in the form of Ellie, but also your incidental companions like Sam or Tess or Bill at one point. You don't, well, I mean, Marlene briefly at the beginning, but anyway, the point is that you, instead of like being the Nathan Drake character where you're the hero, you're like the rugged individualist, or you're only thinking about yourself, you have to have this kind of like paranoid hyper awareness of the people around you. Because the thing is, like, if in a given like moment, if Tess is being attacked by a clicker and you don't fight off the thing that is like killing her in that moment, guess what? You lose, and you'll have to restart over. Have to start the whole encounter all over. And that kind of awareness, that kind of like, it's not a camera constraint on your perspective, but it's almost sort of like a conceptual constraint on your perspective, because you're not necessarily thinking about how am I going to do this like awesome like shimmy across a ledge, or how am I going to jump from one place to another. It's like you both have to think about traversal, but at the same time maintain this like focus on your immediate surroundings as well, that the Uncharted games don't necessarily emphasize. And so I think we should probably talk about sort of the companion system and the way in which it is very different from sort of like the way in which games traditionally sort of think about how to sort of structure the relationship between you as the player character and the sort of these like NPC, like close NPCs, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah. So for me, the biggest thing about The Last of Us was the companion system. Like, really, I think at the end of the day, while I agree that the level design is phenomenal, and it was largely influenced by the narrative design process as well, right? They were very much hand in hand. And then the encounter designs within those levels, even if they were just all level designers, right? The level designer wasn't just building a space or creating a level or a map, they were actually creating a narrative and subjective experience for the player. All of that for me was made possible because of the companion system and the companion animations, right? And the way in which those companions reacted and responded to the player. So, the first thing I think that we're going to talk about for me, right, Nicholas, and I'm going to go ahead and take this one, is that when we see classic companion design, right, we look at you're a single player and you need your D&D party to get through a level. Right? The game was balanced for 4 players in your party. And just like in Dragon Age Inquisition, you essentially can mix and match between your best friends and go on really cool adventures. Sometimes you'll hear dialogue, or sometimes you can choose to just ditch your companions and play solo in Dragon Age. And you can take on that bear, and it's meant for 4 players, and you can try to take him down, right? I think an additional way that Nicholas was looking at companions as well was kind of as more of an objective / I say objective, like force, but also they give you objectives. It was just funny because I was making like a weird wordplay pun there accidentally. But mostly what they do is just kind of explain what you're doing. Now, to the jargon of many Halo players out there, I don't consider Cortana a companion. I do consider a central narrative figure, but she's not really someone who is a companion. It's someone who becomes, right, a parasocial companion to Master Chief. That in of
Yeah.
itself is a whole thing. But the reason why I bring up Cortana, right, and the reason why I bring up, say, any voice on the radio, Maria Hill in Marvel's Avengers, right? Like, you wouldn't consider Maria Hill a companion. You technically wouldn't consider your
Yeah, but
friends if you play, you know what I mean,
yeah.
like friends in a multiplayer game, companions. But technically, right, systemically, we looked at, if you're playing Kamala Khan and you have Hulk, right, Captain America, and Iron Man on your team, they're
Yeah.
essentially your companions, right? Like,
Yeah.
they're getting you through this piece of combat. And companion AI, right, just in combat alone is huge. But the biggest distinction, right, between, say, these 4-player games and this 2-player, right, experience of The Last of Us, right, is that because it's 2 players, right, you're able to kind of look at the relationship at a very intimate level.
Yeah.
Because there's only one other foil, right, to your experience as the player, but also your experience as Joel, right? There is only, and it's not just Ellie, right, but there's only the other person. There's Tess, there's Ellie, I think there's Bill. No.
Bill, yeah,
Bill,
Bill's briefly with you, yeah.
yeah, Bill is briefly a companion. And what's his brother's name is Tommy.
Yeah.
Right? And so the biggest thing for me is recognizing, how do they treat, right, Ellie versus Sarah, just very from the very beginning. And that Sarah's not your companion. Okay, Sarah is your, like, a person to protect. But what they do is they start you in the game as Sarah. Now, this is very important.
Yeah, you play as Sarah, that's
And
right.
you play as Sarah. This is very, very important, because if we look at kind of what we're talking about with the encounter design, but I really am honing in on this as the companion and, like, mechanical level, is that you start the game as Sarah and you end the game as Ellie. And they are, because to Joel, they have become the same person. But what you don't see,
Very problematically, by the way.
very problematically, okay?
Yeah.
But what you don't really see and understand is that this book ending of this experience all comes down to Joel's kind of rebirth and struggle, right, with the paternal within, right?
Yeah.
That, yes, the greater context, but you really get this within the specific companion interactions, right, between Ellie and Joel. And I think this is really what became the heart of this experience for so many players, was
Yeah.
seeing their, at the surface level, you can see how their banter changes, right? But, and you know, and I call it the surface level because that's what you see in here, right? You can see the story between these characters change. You
Yeah.
can see the relationships emotively, right? And how they look at each other in facial cutscenes.
Yeah.
But what's super, super telling is that in the next to last level, Bus Depot versus the Firefly Lab, Ellie is coming to terms. And you as a player can, I hope, see this. And if you didn't see it, then that's fine. Go replay the level. Ellie is coming, or go watch it on YouTube. Ellie is coming to terms with the fact that she is never going to see Joel again. Like, she knows it. There's something inside of her that knows that this is the end,
Yeah.
not the beginning. And Joel's going, this is the beginning, because once we get through this, I get to spend, like, the rest of my time with you.
Yeah.
Okay? Like, this is how Joel's seeing it. He's like, this is just one adventure and a grand adventure. And Ellie is going, it's not. And you can actually see that the way that the companion mechanics that have always performed at 100%, you, the player, are in charge. Ellie is now in charge as an NPC, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that is so much of a credence to her character that my heart actually emotionally dropped. Like, that was the first time where I went, okay, the story, it's not the story that has something. It's
Yeah.
like this mechanical way in which they changed the companion, because I needed to get up to, like, I needed to lift her up to get on, you know, to traverse, right? So she can lift me up.
Yeah.
And she
Yeah.
wasn't coming. She was sitting down and moping. I wanted to have these optional conversations with her, and she was just not talking back to me. They ended up, right? And that is how global systems and a gameplay system and a mechanic of just, like, having a UI prompt appear over a character's head. So
Yeah.
simple, so obvious. And yet they just shut down the conversations. They just
Yeah.
cut the writing, right?
Yeah.
And instead of making it this beautiful bonding moment between two characters, they actually, like, bonded because they weren't talking.
I'm really glad that you brought up the sort of, I mean, I remembered this, but the book ending of Sarah at the beginning and then Ellie at the end, and sort of like Joel's character arc through those, because it is, probably intentionally, a parallel to precisely what we were talking about in terms of like the way in which series of encounters are conceptualized. Because the thing is, like, Sarah is the setup for how you think about Ellie. And in many ways, Ellie begins her journey with Joel from that perspective as well. Because, like, Ellie's story is in many ways a kind of like coming of age slash Bildungsroman, in which, like, she starts off not terribly capable, but develops capabilities over the course of the game that in many ways mirror Joel's. But what's kind of effed about that is that, okay, the point that I made earlier is then that, like, sort of the end term of the sequence is then supposed to make you reconceptualize how you thought about the primary term of the sequence. And so if you think about sort of what was Sarah's end, like the whole like what gets the game going at the end of the prologue is Sarah's murder. And even though Ellie is quote unquote saved at the end, like, in many ways, Joel's attempt to try and sort of like make up for what happened to his daughter with Ellie creates this very perverse, almost like tragic sequence for Ellie. Because the thing is, like, and this is very much in keeping with the classic Bildungsroman, like, nowadays we tend to think of coming of age stories as, like, a kind of happy trajectory, or sort of like a comic trajectory, where, like, things begin in kind of a messed up state, but eventually, like, come together and resolve themselves. But the thing is, like, that's not really what happens to Ellie. Ellie goes from a kind of semi-stable life to one where probably the most important person in her life at that point has lied to her in a profoundly fucked up way. And so it establishes this like pseudo parent-child relationship that, if you then go back and sort of like reflect on Joel's relationship with Sarah at the beginning, it's like, is this trying to tell me that actually there was something fundamentally fucked up about that as well? And I
I
don't
wouldn't
know.
read. I don't.
I don't know. I don't know.
I wouldn't read too much into it. But what I would say is, what's really interesting to denote here is that The Last of Us has very strong core central theming about the face of humanity and the struggle of humanity in a cruel and harsh world.
Yeah.
And I think that when we look at the struggle of humanity, it is very important for me to note that when I played the game, I had no problem murdering humans. And like I said, I think at the beginning of this episode, I murdered more humans than I did zombies. And quite frankly, it's because zombies are terrifying. And also, zombies hurt harder, and clickers are very easy to sneak around. Like, I could get
Yeah.
very close to a clicker and just being super quiet, like, because I'm actually not afraid of that. What I am afraid of is having to restart the level 10 times that I had to do once, and finally went, I'm just not killing any of the zombies. And I
Yeah.
didn't. I killed 0 zombies in Bus Depot. Don't ask me how I did that. I really don't know. But I literally killed 0 of those like 4 juggernauts at the end, and I just ran through. Um, and I think that that's important to note,
Yeah.
because humanity killed Sarah.
Yeah, that's
Humans
true.
killed her with guns, okay?
Yeah.
And at the end, humans would have killed Ellie for humans, right? With
Yeah.
knives, right? And I
Yeah.
know that it's like 2 very different contexts and 2 different situations, but for a main character protagonist, right, in a struggle of humanity, his enemy was never the zombie apocalypse. Like, it wasn't the zombies.
Yeah.
That was who he was fighting. Right? But the enemy was humanity. And at the end, like, right, we could then go super right, meta subjective, and say, well, the enemy was himself. And I'm like, okay, yes, Joel, and yes, literary scholars out there, the enemy is always man versus himself. But if we could just
Yeah.
pause for a moment,
Yeah.
I think that is these multiple layers, right?
Yeah.
That is what, when people talk about, right, the story is incredible, is I
Yeah.
don't think they're talking about the story. Right? They're not talking about the plot. They're not talking about the structure. They're not talking about Joel and Ellie's like relationship, right? They're talking about how they felt when they
Yes.
experienced those layers as a narrative experience in the game.
Yeah, and in I wish I could remember. I don't remember the episode number, but I will link to it in the show notes. We did an episode on what we refer to as subjective progression, which is this concept that we're developing in the book project that we were working on. And it is that sense of like how what the character who is your avatar or who is your focus for whatever reason in the game, like what they are experiencing maps or fails to map onto what you, the player, are feeling. Like that kind of design is so crucial, so hard, so incredibly subtle, because the thing is, if you do it overtly like The Last of Us Part 2 did, people actually really abreacted to it. Like when it was very explicit that like that's like, hey, look, I'm doing this thing where it's like you experience it from this player's perspective, this character's perspective. Now you experience it from this character's perspective. But because of the fact that like Ellie, even though you play as Ellie and Joel, you don't actually see the same events from their two perspectives. It works on you in a much more subtle way. And as a result of that, it very carefully crafts, and it's not just feelings. You're right to say that earlier, because it's also about sort of, the only way I can describe it is a kind of like subjective condition. This idea of like, I'm creating a set of, for lack of a better term, psychological circumstances for my player using all of the tools that are available to me in terms of game design. And so the story doesn't actually have to be that novel or innovative or whatever, because it's really at the level of execution that so much of this is playing out. That's what we wanted to emphasize in this episode.
And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this 100th episode of the Furudashi podcast. Until next time, you can listen to us more on patreon.com/Furudashi, and we will see you then.